Today at the National Press Club, the former US Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu. Dr. Chu led US government thinking on energy and climate change from 2009 until last year. Now he offers his thoughts on how to balance economic growth and cleaner energy in today's National Press Club address.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank Address, our final Press Club address for the year. With the United Nations 20th Convention on Climate Change underway this week in Lima, we are particularly fortunate to be able to welcome our guest here today. And I should mention that if you think we're a little casual today because we're seated, we're heading into Christmas. Well, we are heading into Christmas, but we're seated because our guest unfortunately has a knee injury and is unable to stand, so we've decided we'll conduct our event today in a seated position. Now, as you've just heard, Dr. Stephen Chu is a Nobel laureate. He's the former Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration and a world-renowned figure in research in terms of climate change technology. So to discuss how the world can provide its future energy needs, while at the same time also managing the risks of climate change and sustaining economic growth, would you please welcome Dr. Stephen Chu.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and let me just start straight off. I'm going to be talking about basically two things. I'm going to be talking about what the current status is in energy. I'm going to be talking about some of the risks that we see in climate, but also talking about how I believe in the United States this is happening, it could easily happen in Australia, that the new technologies, the clean technologies, will definitely become and are becoming the low-cost solution regardless of whether there's a climate problem or not. And so I hope to convince you that you could look into this more. I have provided the audience here with some slides as data backup, and I would be happy that if they could, if you email in, that they could also be made available. So let me begin. Let's start with oil. In the United States, the peak of oil production occurred around 1970. And if you look at the record from 1945 through the 1970 to the present time, you find that despite the big Alaskan oil finds, decline of oil production in the United States continued until something started to happen around 2005. And what happened in around 2005 is that technology, which was being developed over a 20-year period, it was not an instantaneous thing, found that if you could fracture rock by pumping water into it, you can release a lot of gas and also oil. And so since that time, from 2005 till the present day, the increase in oil production in the United States has been roughly 4.5 million barrels a day. Let me put that in perspective. That increase is more than the entire oil production of all countries in the world except three: Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States. More than Venezuela, more than Iraq, more than Iran, more than Canada, more than anybody else. The increase. And this is continuing. Natural gas also increased by about 45–50% in the same period of time. Natural gas is now, as it was, a byproduct of oil for the most part. The price of natural gas in the United States plummeted. It was hovering around $4, maybe $3.50 a million BTU. Let me also put that in perspective. Europe, Asia, it's about $15 to $18 a million BTU. And so natural gas, because the costs of transporting are high, but if it's accessible by pipeline, it makes it very inexpensive. So we're about 1/4 the price of natural gas around the world. Now, there's estimates, and these are just estimates. I'll emphasize that because all rock is different, that formations are different. But there are estimates around the world that technically recoverable, and by technically recoverable, I also mean economically technically recoverable. It's very important. A lot of things are recoverable at $200 a barrel, but a lot less is recoverable at $50 a barrel. Technically recoverable gas and oil, estimated roughly, it could be 10 times higher around the world than in the United States. So we have something here that could change the dynamics of oil and gas. It could change a lot of the geopolitical dynamics. The other thing, before this so-called tight oil and tight gas was discovered, was it was presumed that most of the world's supply of oil would be in the form of what's called heavy oil. This is tarry oil, very heavy oil. It's not the light crude that comes out of Texas or Saudi Arabia. It's a very much more viscous. And it was estimated that roughly 70% of the future reserves would be in the form of heavy oil. There's also deep offshore oil, 1 mile deep in the Gulf of Mexico, off Brazil, 2 miles deep. Previously considered non-reachable, now technology has allowed us to get that. Arctic oil was reachable, very expensive, but the costs are coming down. So, due to the huge increase in supplies in tar sands oil and predominantly the very light crude, high-quality oil in the United States from hydraulic fracturing, the supply began to exceed the demand. It was staying there at $100, $110 a barrel for 3.5, 4 years. But finally, the Middle East countries said, we're not going to prop this up by decreasing production because we're just losing market share and it's all going to countries like the United States, and so forget it. And I suspect, although they haven't said this, they're trying to test at what price will production stop and investment stop around the world in deep offshore, in Arctic, and in other places like tight oil. And so, as you all know, the price of oil has gone down dramatically in the last several weeks. It's now in the mid-60s, $65, $66 a barrel. It could go down lower. But this, I think, this is my personal opinion, nothing else. I think that this is a test. You want to hold, if I were Saudi Arabia, I would say, let's hold that price by saying we're not going to decrease production, let it fall to $60 a barrel, maybe even lower, for a couple of years. And let's see what the other countries and companies do in their investments, all right? Because at some level, new investments mean you have to bank on a certain price. And all the oil companies and all the gas companies do this. They typically, well, you have to ask them, but I would say they typically say, we're not going to make an investment unless we can make a considerable profit at $80 a barrel. And so this is a test, but then the question is, how long does that last? And I think it probably will not last 4 or 5 years, an extended period of time, in part because there are many countries, even the Middle East countries have large cash reserves, but other countries like Venezuela, Russia has less cash reserves, have gotten used to running their economies on the income from oil and gas. And because of that, they can't sustain this. And if it continues to stay low at $60, $70 a barrel, or even lower, for an extended period of time, the countries go bankrupt. And then maybe they can find solidarity to avoid bankruptcy, but this is speculation. Anyway, let's talk about some of the issues. I want to briefly mention the fact it's a big contentious debate in the United States regionally, and I understand it's also a debate in Australia, it's a debate in Europe. And this has to do with this technology of hydraulic fracturing. And that means that you insert drilling pipe going down many thousands of feet, 4,000 or 5,000 feet. You tilt the pipe horizontally, and the control of these pipes is fantastic. You can go a couple of kilometers within a few feet of where you want to position this. You perforate the pipe, you put in water, you explode the rock, and oil and gas comes out. And that's what led to this predominant decline in the price of oil and this increase in supply. In the United States, it's now a debate. We have a law that says we cannot export crude oil. We can export refined products. And also a debate as to whether we're going to let companies export natural gas to non-free trade countries in the U.S. And to that extent, this is a debate, but it, in my opinion, will occur at some level. because it does create more wealth in the United States. And the price of natural gas, if it stays between $4 and $6 a million BTU, still gives a tremendous advantage to the United States in terms of low-cost energy. So these are some of the factors that have been going on in the fossil world. Now I want to change topics and discuss what's happening in terms of our environment and climate. And there, as you mentioned, in lieu of this conference in Peru, Lima, Peru, they released 2 months earlier data looking at the year 2014. And that preliminary data, they're waiting for months of November to December to be finalized. But the preliminary data, the international group that monitors and collects all of this said that it appears that this one will be the hottest on record, but certainly one of the 3 hottest on record. Now, it goes on to say that out of the 15th warmest years on record, 14 have occurred in the 21st century. I will do the math for you. There are only 14 years. Despite that, there are many people who say the climate's not changing because in that 14-year period, it's more or less the same. However, if you look back to 1850, 1800, there is no doubt something has happened. There's been a plateau, but there's something that's happened considerably over the last 150 years. Then what to do about it? Let me first indicate that the full cost of fossil fuels, notably coal, oil, natural gas, are not really incorporated in the current price. It's just like if you're a chemical company and you're making chemicals and you take the processing to make those chemicals and you dump it into the river, and no one asked you to clean it up before you dump it into the river, the company says, hey, this is the low-cost solution. I get to dump in the river. You live downstream and say, oops, I've got to spend a lot of money to clean up the water. So the low-cost solution to society is the integrated companies upstream, downstream, the people who draw water from the river. So this is why I'm talking about the full cost. So what are some of the costs? Well, again, over the last 35 years, I've given the press club data taken by reinsurance companies from 1980 till the present time of the number of events that have been caused that trigger insurance losses that reinsurance companies care about. You might ask, what's a reinsurance company? A reinsurance company is a company that insures insurance companies. Insurance companies buy their product, which is good because they believe in their product. But the reason why insurance companies get reinsurance is if there's a major hurricane, a major drought, a major crop failure, they don't have the assets to pay back. And so they get another entity to say, come and give us the money. So reinsurance companies look at major hurricanes, things that trigger insurance losses, earthquakes, hurricanes, heat waves, and the like. And what they find is over the last 35 years, the incidents have been increasing linearly, dramatically. How dramatically? Fourfold, 4 times as much. This is not a 20% effect. And so because of that, they have to raise the rates. They don't want to raise the rates too high because another reinsurance company will undercut them. And so this is a green eye shades calculation for the reinsurance companies. There are other issues. In China especially, the air pollution has been getting very serious, particularly the very small particulate matter, so-called PM 2.5. These are small particles below 2.5 microns. They're so small they get into the deep recesses of your lungs, and it causes emphysema, it causes asthma, and already it's beginning early signs it's going to cause lung cancer. And it affects the oldest people first and the youngest people first. But since we don't know really what's going to happen, if you see this PM 2.5 increasing, it could be that you're actually having your 1-year-old and 2-year-old starting to smoke packages of cigarettes per day. This is not good. And so because of that, China has become, over the last 15 years, very concerned about this. All right, another few things that we've been measuring: sea level rise. Right now, the sea level average over the globe is increasing by 3.2 millimeters a year. All right, it doesn't sound like much. But if you look over the 200-year record or 150-year record, you find that that rate has increased dramatically, maybe fivefold. So it's curving up. It's curving up dramatically. And so, because you can think, hey, 3.2 millimeters a year, and unless you're living within a meter or two of sea level, you're safe. No, it's curving up. And also what is happening in coincidence is the storms, the number of storms is roughly constant over the last 30 years, but the ferocity of storms has increased. And so this little trickle of rise and the ferocity of storms mean you are much more threatened. And so this is going, these are just measurements. That's all there is. I'm not talking about climate models. So for that, I say that this is epidemiology. Let's see what's happening. People smoke cigarettes. 25 years later, they keel over, on average. And in fact, specifically, you can say in the United States, historically, you look at from 1900 to 2005, we started as a non-smoking country. By 1965, the average consumption of adult males was 220 packs a year, including the non-smokers. 220 packs a year. The incidence of lung cancer deaths started rising well above the noise by the 50s and 60s. By 1964, the Surgeon General said, we have to put a warning label on cigarettes packages saying, caution, cigarette smoking may be dangerous to your health. Warning labels have gotten more specific as time went on. In the United States in the 70s and the 80s, there was a huge campaign to educate school children in elementary school, junior high school, and high school, say, don't start smoking. Because by then we knew that tobacco smoking was one of the most addictive things you could do. Very hard to stop. Market share went down considerably, 60%. And so the tobacco companies had to export to other countries, notably China, Eastern Europe, India. 25 years later, the deaths due to lung cancer peaked and started to decline. So from that we know, on average, the damage you do to yourself has to wait 25 years. Some people get lung cancer in 5 years. Some people never get lung cancer. Indeed, the tobacco company in the 60s and 70s and 80s were saying, no, their correlation does not mean causation. Medical community cannot predict who's going to get lung cancer, who does not. You don't understand the detailed biology. Therefore, what's to worry? And so that proceeded, but now we know a lot of things. We know that if you were smoking half a pack or more a day, you have a 25 times higher chance of dying from lung cancer. So, and there's a 25-year delay from the time you start smoking, on average, to the time you get it. All right, there's an analogy to this in climate change. Number one, we actually don't know the damage we as a society have already done with greenhouse gases. It's not 25 years, but we don't know how long it is. It could be 50 years, it could be 100 years, it could be 150 years. So what we've already put in the atmosphere means you start continuing to glide up in temperature, even if humans stop emitting everything today. So let's take an average of this uncertainty, 50 years. So it's comparable, or double the lung cancer issue. Once the CO2 is in the atmosphere, how long does it take? Warmer, more CO2, more plants, you take the CO2, you put it into biomaterial. So there's a feedback mechanism that takes it down. Indeed, the feedback mechanism of absorbing CO2 in the atmosphere, half of it goes into the ocean. If you do just counting, how much have we stuck up since the Industrial Revolution, and you look how much is up there, you're missing half. And then you go and look at the ocean and the acidity of ocean, because when you get carbon in the ocean, you make, soda, sparkling water is weakly acidic. The pH, the acidity of the ocean, has increased by 30%. Not 3%, 30%. And so we know where it went because the acidity has increased. These are measurable quantities. How long will now, once the CO2 is up there, it cycles in land, it gets incorporated into the biosphere, in plants, it goes into the ocean, it does a lot of things. And how long will, but it's circulating around, the vast fraction is circulating around. How long will it stay in the atmosphere? We don't know. Could be 50 years before more plant life scarfs it down. And there's a slow sequestration of the ocean, which I talked about. Could be 100 years, but it's not. The estimate is somewhere between 500 and 1,500 years. All right, let's go back to smoking. You smoke, you incur the risk. Your choice. We smoke in climate change analogy. We don't incur the risk. Our children and grandchildren incur the risk, and our grandchildren's grandchildren incur the risk. So you say, what's to worry? Not my problem. So I would say we want to think about this. Now, let me transition on to something a former Saudi oil minister said, and he said the Stone Age came to an end, not for lack of stones, and the oil age will come to an end, but not for lack of oil. Now, that's not why he was this former Saudi oil minister. What he really meant is that you transition to better solutions. And by better solutions, what he was thinking of is you go from the Stone Age to the Metal Ages. And it's important to say, what are these better solutions? Are there better solutions? And by better solutions, I don't only mean environmentally better solutions. It has to be environmentally better, but also allowing economies to prosper and grow, right? Now, as you all know, there was I believe, an historic announcement made by China and the United States in the last couple of weeks. And the United States pledged to cut carbon emissions by 26 to 28% from its peak of 2005 by 2025. There was a pledge made by President Obama in Copenhagen, where he said we pledge to decrease carbon emissions by 17% by 2020. We've already done that. We've decreased carbon emissions in the United States by 17% by today. So he said, hey, this was easier than we thought, better than we thought. Let's up the ante. China, for the first time, a developing country, we refused to talk about any emissions cap, any coal cap, anything like that, said by 2030 we will begin to decrease or at least cap the emissions of carbon dioxide or sooner. We will cap the use of coal by 2030 or sooner, and by 2030 or sooner we will be 20% renewable energy. And so they are very serious, and the reason they're very serious is because a lot of engineers in the government in China, and you also don't have to run for re-election, and the combination means that you have to look out after the long-term interests of the people, and they are frightened to death that in northern China, due to, in large part, water misuse, but if you have a changing climate, the water supply in the northern half of China is threatened, and that's a big deal. And so they also, for them, set very, very ambitious goals, saying, well, capping carbon by 2030 or less than that, what's the big deal there? Well, you have to look at historically what's been happening from 1980 to 2014. The carbon emissions in China increased fivefold. It's going up like that. And for them to say it's going up like that and we want to make it go like this in a similar period of time is saying, and knowing that it might have some impact in the economy, is saying this really matters to us, and they're trying to steer a course where it will have a less of an impact or minimal impact. What about the United States? You could say, looking from halfway around the world, that Washington Congress is deadlocked, and you're right. There will be no comprehensive energy and climate legislation for the next 2 years, and that's just reality. But what's happening is the states of the United States are the leaders, led by California, the biggest economy in the United States, but the 8th biggest economy in the world. They say by 2025 or 30, I forget, but 32% renewable energy. But it's just not California. If you look across the United States and look at the economies across the United States, by that I mean California, Texas, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois have bigger economies than North Dakota. And 78% of the economy in the United States has mandatory renewable portfolio standards. By law, you have to, by certain dates, generate clean energy by renewables. If you consider all the states that have mandatory and the others that have goals, it turns out to be 86%. So in the United States, the vast majority of the economy of the United States is committed towards this. The last, and this is historically true, the last entity to move in the United States is the federal government, because we have a constitution that has designed stability into the federal government. So I'm just stating a fact. All right, there are other things. There's a Supreme Court ruling that said carbon dioxide can be treated as a pollutant, just as SOx or NOx or mercury. Had a first court challenge. Supreme Court challenge, Supreme Court again ruled, most of the essential ingredients stand. There will be other court challenges. But it's clear to me that a large fraction of what has happened will stand. Once it stands, and the EPA then says we're allowed to regulate this, we're allowed to limit emissions in the United States. Another factor, not only in the United States, but internationally, most of the major oil companies, all the major companies I know, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, they all have an internal price on carbon. ExxonMobil says by 2030, we see internally, we make investment decisions that say there's a $60 price on carbon per ton. So, all right, now let's talk about solutions. I'll very briefly mention energy efficiency, a very big deal. Half of the reduction in carbon emissions will come from energy efficiency, but there's better news. Energy efficiency, if done right, if done correctly, doesn't cost money, it saves money. Long before I knew about climate change, long before, decades before I was Secretary of Energy, I was a big fiend, and I use the word fiend because I think that's the way my wife considers it, to save energy in a house, in electricity, in heating. And I explained to people, no, this is not about climate change. I want to save energy because I'm cheap. And also, there are other things. Appliance standards, it turns out to have saved American public tremendous amounts of not only energy but money. A study that is being published now by me and some colleagues looked at a lot of data. To our great surprise, it not only saved money in terms of the purchase of the appliance and the cost of operating it in energy bills, but the purchase price went down. How could the purchase price go down if you put a standard that says you can't make really inefficient stuff? You can't make junk. And there are many theories of why that might go down, but the predominant economic theory is that could not have gone down because the free market should have taken care of that. If there was no regulation, you want to sell the best, most efficient, cheapest product. And so in our first submission to the journal Science, we got 2 very bad reviews and 1 very good review, and so Science decided to reject it. It's coming out, but the reviews could be summarized as follows by the economists who reviewed the paper. This may work in practice, but it doesn't work in theory. All right. Buildings, similar sort of thing. You have in the portfolio ways to incentivize building more efficient buildings. There's a split incentive, unless you're a university or a government who's going to occupy the building and pay for the energy bills. Normally, you build a building, you sell it, the developer builds a building, sells it, the building owner says, okay, we'll charge rent, and the people who rent pay the energy bills. So there's a clear saying that, oh, you just offload a more efficient building, saving energy on the last people, namely the people who rent the building. You can do much better than that, and I've indicated how you can do that. It's also very important because it's not the design of the building, it's the performance of the building. And over the last 20 years, as you try to design much more efficient buildings, you fall short further and further. It's possible to design without any additional cost, energy-saving buildings, and I say that, again, without any additional cost. But this is not known for most of the building community. So I'm a professor, so I'm going to start giving you some quiz questions, true or false questions. Don't look so nervous. There will be no math. So, true or false? Renewable energy will be more expensive than fossil fuels for at least a decade. How many believe that is true? Okay. How many believe that is false? All right. And about half didn't vote. I should have said you have to take the quiz. So let me just tell you what's happening in the United States. In the United States, when you build a major wind farm or solar farm, this is hundreds of megawatts. It's not a rooftop. What you do before you get the investment money, you have a signed agreement with a utility company or a set of utility companies to say they will buy your electricity at a certain price for the next 20 years. That is the way we do business in the United States. And so a good measure of what the real costs are what are the contracts, because in that contract is the profit. You know, these are developers who go out and borrow money and they invest in it and they want 8 or 9% profit. And right now in the Midwest, for example, the contracts are going for about $30 a megawatt hour. I don't know if you know how much it costs a megawatt hour in Australia for wholesale electricity, but new electricity with our natural gas at its historical low is $50 a megawatt hour. I've been told that in Australia it's about $100, but I could be wrong. It could be at least, I'm sure it's at least $50 a megawatt hour, all right? So this is what's happening. Now, to be fair, there is a production tax credit on wind. That production tax credit, the Wind Association says in a couple of years we don't need it. It probably need less of it now, and it can sunset in a couple of years. Because wind has become far cheaper than new coal and is going to become cheaper than new natural gas. I emphasize the word new. If you have an old power plant, a jalopy, built 30 or 40 years ago, held together by Band-Aids, grandfathered in so there's no pollution requirements, and totally written off and depreciated, that's a money maker until the maintenance costs overcome you, all right? And so I emphasize new, but remember, this is a jalopy spewing out all sorts of stuff, and as I say, smoking. All right, so let's talk about wind in Australia relative to wind in the United States. Wind has some of the best wind resources, land resources in the world. Australia is not bad in southwest Australia. It's very, very good, and there's significant wind penetration there. Some reasonable fraction of the electricity generated in South Australia is wind. Solar PV. Over the last 40 years, the price of solar modules has declined by 40 times. 40, not 40%, 40 times. And it's going to decline at least by another twofold, and then it'll probably level out. Because when it's 50 cents for a module that generates a watt of electricity, it's becoming de minimis, in part because the transportation, the handling costs, everything else become larger. And so it's becoming like high-quality paint. In the United States, the solar resources are fantastic. And indeed, over the last several years, from 1990, there was essentially, and before, there was essentially no investment in solar. It remained at a very slow, steady rate until about 2009. And from 2009 to 2013, it went up tenfold. Why? I don't know. I was Secretary of Energy during that time. Actually, I do know because I was in charge of a loan program that made loans to install large quantities of solar at utility scale. Those loans are going to be paid back It's profitable. The loan program overall is now on target to net $5 billion. Despite all the rhetoric of what a failure was, and we're not venture capitalists, a large fraction of the loans are going to be paid back in full. And we could have made $20 million or more if we could charge what the traffic would bear, but we're not in it to make money. We're in it to promote things that otherwise the financial community would not invest in. Since that time, wind farms, solar farms are deemed by the financial community to be a good bet. If you want a portfolio that gets 9–8% return on your capital, you go there. You want more, 20–30%, you do other things. But you have a diversified portfolio. What about Australia in terms of solar? Australia's solar resources are enormous compared to the United States. They're incredible. They're probably some of the best in the world. You are blessed with a lot of sun in the middle of Australia with very few people. So you have a great opportunity. Let me go back to the United States. Look at the contracts, the agreements of big wind and big solar farms to sell electricity at a guaranteed rate, a guaranteed price. And this summer, 1914, a contract in Texas was signed that would deliver solar power wholesale at $50 a megawatt hour, the price of new natural gas. From 2008 to 2014, the contract prices have dropped fourfold. This is real business. I'm not talking about some person saying, oh, it's really great and everything. I'm looking at contracts, okay? It's very different. And so what I see, is solar and wind still getting less and less expensive, passing by natural gas in the United States, which is the cheapest in the world, including the transmission costs, okay? Not including the storage costs. And so this is very good news. Now, I should mention the incentives in the United States. It wouldn't be fair. And in solar, there's a 30% investment tax credit. If you spend $1 million on a solar installation, you get 30% back. That expires in 2016. I think by 2022, you ramp it from the 30% to 10%, which is available to all U.S. investments, virtually all of them. And so I strongly believe solar does not need a subsidy after 2020, 2022. The wind tax credit, even the wind industry says, we won't not need a subsidy in the next couple of years. And so I'm going to go radical and say, not really, it's very conservative. I said, all these tax subsidies should be ramped up by 2022. But let's be fair. Let's also get rid of all the subsidies and incentives and special tax treatments for oil, gas, coal, and pipelines, and just make a level playing field. Now, subsidies for oil, gas, and coal in the United States have been going on for about 100 years. Subsidies for renewables have been going around for about 20 years, since the middle 1970s, 25 years. Okay, no, sorry, 50 years. Maths, I'm messing up on my own maths. So if you end one subsidy in 50 years, the other in 100 years, I say that's fair. Just level the playing field. And you need nothing more than that. I do think it's a proper role of government to pay for research and development in new technologies. The government paid for the research and development of hydraulic fracturing. If it wasn't for the government research, we wouldn't have been hydraulic fracturing. And so that's another thing. Another few proposals. You have to put a price on carbon, just as you have to put a price on polluting waters and pollution of air. But don't put a sudden price on it. You have to go slow and steady. So let's say in 2015 you start with a very small price, $10 a ton, and just have it march up. And I actually like the ExxonMobil model. They said by 2030, make it 60. They're saying make it $60 a ton. I say we don't even need that. Make it $60 a ton by 2035 or 2040, and then hold it at that price. Why do you want to do it slowly and steadily? Industry has to have time to adapt Industry has to have time to innovate. It would be too much of an economic shock and burden on the country to do it suddenly. You don't want to do it suddenly. But if you say over a 20, 25-year period, here's where we're going, think about it. History has shown in everything like this that once you get it out of the political arena, and once you remove it from the lobbyists and give it to the engineers, good things happen, okay? And it becomes much cheaper than ever anticipated. What do you do with the money? Give it back to the people. Don't give it back every year. Give it back every paycheck, every 2 weeks. And in the paycheck, you have a little bold print. You're paying more for your energy. Here's the money back. You get to spend it any way you want. You want to buy an iPhone? You can buy an iPhone. If you want to buy a car that gets 10 miles a gallon, your choice, right? And so, but you have to give it back fairly. You have to give it back to the retired community. You have to give it back to working people. You have to give it back to the unemployed and employed people. The unemployed is a little harder. We have to figure out a way. All the others, you can see a way. You know, you have Social Security, as we do. You know, you have, taxes. People pay taxes. You can do that. Okay. Okay.
Now, I don't want to hurry us, Dr. Chu, but we're getting towards our hour and we haven't had any questions yet. So I certainly want you to run through the important things that you've got,
okay,
because we're reaching a conclusion.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Last question then, true or false? Given the plunging cost of solar and wind power, given that many countries have integrated wind and solar to 25% of the generated electricity average over the year, and given the fact that we run some risks in climate change, here's the question. True or false? The majority of Australians still prefer to pay more for electricity generated by fossil fuels. I'll stop there.
Stop immediately. I thought you had a few more points that you wanted to make, and because I've been looking at the presentation that you did distribute through the room, so perhaps we can make some of those points in question time. Look, let me ask the first question. You have been reported during your stay in Australia as describing it as strange, terribly strange, I think was the direct quote, that we, in terms of the policy that we take in this country on nuclear energy, you obviously see it as something that we should be embracing in terms of using nuclear energy and also in terms of offering ourselves to store nuclear energy. But I guess the question is not just why, but how do you convince a population that that's something that is the sensible thing to do?
Well, let me be precise. I think it's terribly strange that Australia has put off the table a consideration of nuclear. I think it should be considered because it is carbon-free, but also because it is a source of what's called dispatchable energy. It's high density, and you can turn it on and off. And you need backup energy from, you imagine a world where you have great wind and solar, but, sometimes the sun doesn't shine. And so at 50% penetration of intermittent renewable, you need something to back it up. And nuclear is one of those. And so I could see a world by mid-century of quarter fossil, quarter nuclear, the rest renewables, to give you energy stability, no brownouts, no blackouts. Nuclear is very much more expensive currently than fossil because we haven't figured out how to make these new nuclear reactors on time, on budget. It's different if you can make them on time, on budget. So I am an advocate for looking at it. When I was Secretary of Energy, I was very supportive of supplying research in small modular reactors. These are smaller ones that you can make in a factory and ship out. We don't know whether they're going to be cost effective, but the major attraction of small modular reactors is, and the design criteria of we're going to even lend people a little money to do engineering would be, not lend, but give to do engineering, would be that these reactors, if you lost total control of the electricity, water supply, everything, just hands off, would never melt down. And by meltdown, you would never have a contamination problem. It's possible because they're much smaller, have much less thermal inertia and mass and things like that. And so this is one of the concerns that the American public, I think public at large, have. They're worried about contamination and meltdown. And so so now whether that becomes economically viable and a part of the low-cost solution, I don't know. But because this is a very important issue and we want to diversify supply, I advocate you look into it seriously.
I'll take a question now from Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny, Dr. Chu from the Age and Sydney Morning Herald. You began your address talking about offshore oil a mile and 2 miles deep and saying that the economics of that have changed so that that's now accessible. I wonder, is there a danger that just as renewable energy becomes cheaper and, as you say, the playing field gets levelled, that there's a countervailing force where that kind of fossil fuel also becomes cheaper to access and operates in the other direction? And if I could just add a quick addendum to that, can you explain, in your view, given that you've been both a politician and a scientist, why climate change is a left-right issue, why it so often cleaves on those political lines?
Okay, let me first, the first question, could it get cheaper? The answer is yes, and it has. In fact, it was impossible to go a mile deep 20 years ago. So it became impossible to viable at $100 or even $80 a barrel, and it will continue to improve. However, the costs are considerable. These floating semi-submersible rigs that you see, the buy-in is about $6 to $10 billion per rig. And so this is not something you pop a hole in the ground in Texas and out squirts oil. And there are risks. I spent about 3 months in summer 2010 helping BP put out a completely out of control well, and we went completely off the manual. You had to figure out what to do. And again, the safety things that were on the standard rigs of that time, I discovered were very inadequate. So you have to increase the safety. You know, it's been costing BP tens of billions, at least $20, $30 billion. If they were a small company, they wouldn't have $30 billion. They just go belly up, don't even stop at Chapter 7. You just go immediately to Chapter 11 and liquidation. But BP hired another company to actually do the exploration. A much smaller company could have done that. And so it's going to get cheaper, but I think there have to be safeguards in all things. Now, in terms of, what was your next question? Yes, left, right. I don't have any idea. In the United States, 15 years ago, it was not left, right. There are a number of people on the conservative side who are concerned about climate change. The very statement you're conservative means something, and about conserving and preserving the environment. So I think some of it has to do with the big companies, the big industry saying we don't want regulation, we don't want things, and they say, who will listen to us? That has something to do with it. It should not have been politicized. What is a political legitimate question is what's the best course? And I emphasize, what's the best course to get us where we want to go and go to the low-cost solution without crippling the economy, and quite the opposite, by taking advantage, and this is what I passed over, by taking advantage of the new technology. It requires much more thinking. It doesn't happen automatically. And as you all know from your personal experience, if there's a new technology, and you know, as you get on with the years, yeah, I don't know, what's this all about? And so to take advantage of the new technology requires more thinking. And if you're a regulated utility company with a guaranteed return on investment, why should you think? You want to be safe. You want to avoid blackouts. You run a risk of introducing new technology. And so the part of the way to get there is to start piloting these new technologies, but I will emphasize that a half a dozen countries around the world with essentially no real ties to other grids have gotten 25% renewables with no blackouts. So there are already existence proofs that it can be done at the 25% level. They want to go to 50%. So surely other countries can start at 25%, learn what they did.
David Spears.
David Spears from Sky News. Thanks for your speech. I want to ask you about subsidies. Now, you did say that we could ramp out subsidies for wind and solar by 2022, but you also said we could keep marching up with a price on carbon to 2035, a price of about $60. Isn't a price on carbon an effective form of subsidy? It is an intervention in the market that puts a price on fossil fuels but not renewables. And can I ask also, what about subsidising developing countries? This Green Climate Fund, Australia today's announced it's tipping in $200 million. Is that about the right sort of figure we should be contributing?
Okay, let me turn the question around and ask if you say that if you do something, again, the chemical company, and you're pouring effluent, or a sewage company, and you're pouring sewage directly into the river, there are two ways of doing it. You can either regulate and say you can't do that anymore, and then you pay the price, or you can say you're going to put a price on it and do it that way, okay? And a tax on all the stuff you're allowed to throw in the river. Is that a subsidy? No, I'd say that's the cost of producing the plastics or the fertilizer or the cost of living in a city and having a sewage system. That is not, in my mind, that's not a subsidy. That's just the cost of business. Why do we need a price on carbon? You didn't ask this, but why do you need a price on carbon if renewables and electricity become the low-cost solution? Well, steel, cement, petrochemicals emit a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay? So what's the low-cost solution if you're a steel plant? To emit no carbon? I'm sorry, that shuts down the steel plant. The low-cost solution would be, if there's a price, to go to more efficient ways of making steel. And believe it or not, there's just not one way. There's good ways and there are really bad ways, and they vary by more than a factor of 5 for the same grade of steel. Okay? So you can do it really badly or you can do it efficiently, but so that's why you need a price. Your last question is about the developing countries and any developing countries. I think a very complicated question. Again, a political question that I fully understand, because a lot of people say, well, we're worried about our own economy. We're worried about jobs in our own country. And if you're an OECD country, and so why would she pay for this? I think while I'm in favor of it, it has to be done in a very careful way. And most of the investment that can be done can actually be done in the private sector that makes money. And that's something, if you look at the sovereign wealth funds of countries, Norway, Singapore, others, they're beginning to do this, and they want to make money. This is not, they're not taxpayers saying, okay, we're going to do this. And so I would say look to those companies where the government's, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Go make us money. And a lot of that also includes green investments. There is a much better way of the government, not direct subsidy, you were going to buy something, but to guarantee financing, which is a very low-cost way. And that's in part what these sovereign wealth funds are doing. So you say, we will be kind of an insurance company on our portfolio basis. Some small fraction will fail and not pay back, but on balance, a lot of them will pay back. And that's a very cost-effective way of leveraging any taxpayer money. But I go back to saying, there's lots of places where they just want to make money.
Deb Nesbitt.
Deb Nesbitt, editor of Carbon Extra. Dr. Chu, you would be aware that there is this debate here in Australia around the future of our renewable energy target, and that has caused within the sector an investment strike. Clean Energy Council says about $14 billion worth of fully approved, shovel-ready projects, mostly wind, are just not proceeding at the moment. I've watched over the last 4 or 5 years since the GFC, the Obama administration, pour millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into renewable energy, clean technology, energy efficiency, battery storage. And now the economy is slowly improving, jobs figures are looking better. To what extent can that investment in the clean tech, sector, clean energy sector, be credited with contributing to that economic improvement? I guess I want to know, does it really employ a lot of people, or the same amount of people that the fossil fuel sector or resources sector might? How important is it, for Australia's economy, do you think?
Well, those are all very good questions. I think, in my opinion, and opinion of many economists, that when a country is in recession, stimulating the economy in wise ways is actually okay if you don't go overboard. This stimulus that was voted on in 2009 that went for, well, during the time I was there, I got $26 billion a year for my budget and another $34 billion in this stimulus. And the stimulus, we said, was how can we use this to go forward in a policy way, but do it in a way that it will actually generate private sector investments as well. Personally, I don't believe in subsidizing, paying for half or a third of something that you don't see has legs, because I've seen in the past many companies go in there, and as long as there's a subsidy, someone wants to pay for half, I'm in. As soon as the subsidy's on, I'm out. This is not the way you want to do it. And so I think, despite all the attacks, the loan program was a good way to do this, economically efficient way to do this. As I said before, the banks, Wall Street, did not want to make long-term loans, 20, 25-year paybacks for $500 million, $300 million. Too risky. Not only not too risky, not really too risky, they were making loans that get a 3-year payback at 25% interest. Who wants 10-year, 20-year payback at 8% interest? So they weren't even making loans because they got into better things. Bad mortgages, bundled, securitized, and you can sell them as AAA bonds. That was a big moneymaker for a while. And so, so the stimulus of that, in order to do those things, actually got the industry going in a major way. Your question about whether there was net jobs and net losses, I don't know. Or because the proper question, is it a net increase? Could there have been other ways to create jobs that would have created equal numbers of jobs? That I really don't know. But, you know, you can spend money asking people to dig a hole in the ground and then fill it up, and that's not really productive. During the Great Recession of the 30s, the United States embarked on making lots of hydroelectric dams, public buildings, schools, things like that, till this day have been paid off in full by what it gave to society in terms of electricity, in terms of